Welcome, everyone. We're going to give everybody about a minute to get on. A little bit of housekeeping before we officially start the conversation and this wonderful talk tonight. We do not have the chat open. If you have a question, you can place it in the bottom. There's a Q&A tab on the bottom of Zoom. You can enter your question in there. We will answer the questions. Actually, Amy will answer the questions at the end of her lecture. Welcome, everyone. So are you excited, Amy? I'm so ready for this. This is going to be fantastic.
I'm excited. I think it's nervous excitement, but excitement nonetheless.
Wonderful. Well, I want to welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Kelly Font-of-Dietz. I'm the Vice President of Collections and Public Engagement, and I've been at Stratford for 4 years and some change. Amy, who's our wonderful curator, we started literally on the same day. So I feel like we've been in the trenches for a while, and we sort of both found a passion for material culture at some point in our life and ended up at Stratford together. So it's been wonderful working with you, Amy. You are brilliant, and you have endless, capacity to find and research all sorts of cool things. And tonight we get to hear about 18th century mourning, which I'm delighted to hear about. Again, as we were talking before we pressed record, a lot of folks think about, 19th century Victorian era mourning, sort of like the black cloaks and all the Gothic stuff. So I'm ready to sit back and listen to this colonial party here. It's going to be awesome. And on All Saints Day, right? So what better time?
Appropriately themed, yes.
Exactly. Awesome. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to you. Again, if you have a question, put it in the box below, and we will go ahead and let Amy start. Thank you so much, Amy.
Oh, thank you, Kelly. So I'm just going to share my screen. And of course, it's on the wrong slide, so let's fix that. I'm also going to switch off my camera because I find it very distracting to see myself in the corner of the screen. All right, Kelly, you can see this?
Okay.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Okay, so yes, hello everyone. As Kelly mentioned, my name is Amy Connolly and I am Stratford's curator. I'm excited to get into this topic and dive into the deep melancholic world of death and mourning. But firstly, just a little bit about my background. I'm from the west coast of Ireland, in case you're wondering what that girl's strange accent is. And I got my undergraduate degree in design for stage and screen, and then I went on to get my master's at the National College of Art and Design in Dublin in design, history, and material culture. So one of my passions is material culture, with a particular interest in the ways we materialize memory. So in case you missed it, an email was sent out and these spooky cocktails were put on social. So I hope some of you are enjoying a spooky cocktail this evening, or at least screenshot your screen right now, take a picture and attempt to make it later in the week. I'm all for dragging, Halloween out for as long as possible. And I believe Christmas can wait a little longer. So firstly, what drew me to talking about death and mourning in the first place? So as Kelly mentioned, aside from it being All Saints Day and Halloween was just last night, it's a topic that I have a vested interest in. While some people would avoid talking about the topic completely and brand it as too macabre, I feel like death is one that appeals to the large majority. And I would argue that, a lot of us, and especially those of you joining us tonight, have the same amount of kind of morbid curiosity within you. So I personally feel that, having this sort of frank understanding of death and mortality, ultimately provides a healthier outlook on, the one life that we do have. And so this was the case for mourners in the 18th and 19th century. Death is inevitable. We cannot avoid it. So let's just embrace it and all its weirdness and strangeness. And grieving and mourning, for instance, is what makes us fundamentally human, after all. We can go back 130,000 years and see evidence of Neanderthals burying their dead with tools and bones. It's such an integral part of the human experience. And, I would argue that even remembering the dead is so much a part of it. And unfortunately for us, memories are not, immortal. Even memories of the deceased eventually die when those who are left behind to remember pass, but we still do it. So we humans are fond of materializing memory through objects, and this happens in so many cultures. So when I first started putting this slide together, I just assumed in my head that 90% of the talk would involve mourning in the 19th century. It's a period of mourning that attracts a lot of people because it's a century that's essentially associated with, you know, the dead and bizarre Victorian practices surrounding them. But however, as I spent a lot of time researching this talk, and I just like to preference that I'm no means the authority on this topic, but I've chosen to center this talk around the 18th century mourning and death practices with like a primary focus on the Lee era and Westmoreland County in particular. And I stop around the 1820s, around the time when the Lees were no longer here at Stratford. I also find the 18th century is just fascinating in general. It's a period of history that I specialize in, especially when we look at it through an American lens. You know, this new world where cultures are colliding and colonists are trying to maintain and uphold these old English ways, especially with regard to death. Right. I'd also like to just preface that, you know, there is so much content to cover here, so I'm going to try and cover as much as possible. This essentially could be a series, so maybe I'll do a 19th century mourning lecture at some other point. But let's open it up with this incredible portrait by Charles Willson Peale called Mrs. Peale Lamenting the Death of Her Child, Rachel Weeping. So before I get into this, I just want to say Peale's work is so easily identifiable. I think it's something to do with the eyebrows and the eyes of the sitters. They're always quite similar. And it makes me wonder if he paints himself in his artwork unintentionally, like a lot of artists do, but I just think his work is very recognizable. But I digress. Anyways, the portrait, it's incredibly poignant. You know, we have a weeping Rachel, Peale's wife, sitting behind the corpse of her child, Margaret. And what's really interesting about the painting is that originally the portrait was just of the deceased child who died of smallpox. And 4 years later, Peale decided to add his weeping wife to the imagery. Margaret was the fourth child in the family to pass, and sadly, this was not an uncommon occurrence in the 18th century. You know, child mortality rates were incredibly high. So what is this portrait telling the viewer? So every painting has a story or a message behind it, and ultimately, this portrait is embodying and mirroring those depictions of Madonna and child, and essentially, it's symbolizing, you know, the sanctity and sacredness of the familial bond. Some historians even argue that this is a very blunt depiction of the reality of death from smallpox, and was Peale's way of sort of addressing the need for inoculation, as smallpox was rampant in the colonies, especially in this part of the 18th century. So essentially, this painting is a call to action, so to speak. Behind Mrs. Peale, let me just get my little laser out. Behind Mrs. Peale here, we can see these medicine bottles, which again, you know, are showing that these futile attempts to prevent the tragedy. What's really wonderful about the portrait is the way that Peale displayed it. You know, Peale had his own museum, which was essentially a cabinet of curiosity. And if I could time travel, I would have loved to have seen it, complete with taxidermy and fossils and his artwork. And this painting in particular, the Rachel Peale painting I'm referring to. So he displayed this portrait, but he hid it behind a green curtain that could be pulled aside for viewing. And with it, he added this warning: before you draw this curtain, consider whether you will affect a mother or a father who has lost a child. So it's essentially an 18th century viewer discretion advised, warning the viewer of, you know, the painting's morbid content and the effects that it may have on other visitors. One of the painting's most famous viewers was John Adams, future US president at the time, and he reported that he was much moved by it. Unfortunately for Rachel, she died during the birth of their 10th child, and this was a fear that was, a reality for so many women in this time period. Alice Shippen, who is a Lee, she's the daughter of the Thomas Lee who founded Stratford Hall here. She lost 6 children in their infancy over a 15-year period. So I cannot imagine the toll that would take on your body, both mentally and physically. And sadly, it appeared that it did. Her only surviving daughter, Nancy, wrote in 1784 that her mother became more indifferent about worldly matters than ever I saw her. So let's talk about life expectancy. The average life expectancy for a man in Virginia in the early 18th century was 48 years old. I'm going to throw some statistics out here now, so bear with me. 1/3 to half of all children lost at least one parent by the age of 21. And in the South, that number was higher. More than half of children under 13 had lost one parent. Many children, did not survive until adulthood, and 1 in 10 infants died before they reached the age of 1, just like Margaret Peel in the previous portrait. So with these high death rates, funerals, were very much a part of regular day-to-day life in the 18th century. And colonial funerals followed the same or similar etiquette to that of English funerals back in the Old World. Taking a little water break for a second. So funerals essentially were places to see and be seen. It was primarily a social gathering for, privileged circles of society. So much so that there was a societal pressure to gift your attendees funeral swag, for lack of a better word, which included gloves, mourning rings, scarves, and even alcohol. And this practice was, very common in New England and Massachusetts in the 17th century and early 18th century. But there are records of it happening in the South in some cases. So, as you can imagine, this was an immense cost for the family of the deceased. Supplying the gloves alone would cost a small fortune. And so it's really interesting. In 1742, Massachusetts bans gifting rings, scarves, gloves, and alcohol to curb spending, as it offended Puritan leaders. Gloves were then restricted to just the pallbearers in most cases. So when we think of mourning wear, we tend to think a lot of the 19th century, but just like the 19th century, the 18th century mirrored the fashionable silhouettes of the period, but just in black. So initially a woman would start out in a dull matte black. These were usually favored, and as time passed, more sheenier or lustrous fabrics were introduced. Hair was usually covered, which wasn't uncommon in the 18th century. As you can see on your screen, whether it was a cap, a hat, or a veil. And usually the wearer was sporting some sort of fan or handkerchief. So I'm going to hone in on some case studies of some examples of death in Westmoreland County specifically, and the examples of people's relationship towards their own death. So for those of you joining us tonight and you don't know where Stratford Hall is, or you've never heard of Westmoreland County, Stratford Hall was built in 1738 and founded by Thomas Lee and his wife Hannah Ludwell Lee, and it's situated here in Westmoreland County on your screen. But Westmoreland County is part of a larger area of Virginia known as the Northern Neck, and Westmoreland County was home to the Lees, it was home to the Carters of Nominee Hall, and it's even George Washington's birthplace. So in 1749, in Thomas Lee's will, he included his funeral request. So Having observed much indecent mirth at funerals, I desire that last piece of human vanity be omitted, and that attended only by some of those friends and relatives that are near. My body may be silently interred with only the church ceremony, and that a sermon for instruction to the living be preached at the church as any other day. So Thomas here made it clear he did not want the frivolities or anything overly extravagant or ostentatious at his funeral. Perhaps my favorite part of his will is his burial request. He wished to be buried between my late dearest wife and my honored mother, and that the bricks on the side next to my wife may be moved and my coffin placed as close to hers as possible without moving it or disturbing the remains of my mother. Excuse me. And I just think that's such a lovely thought and request, and it just says so much about the relationship between the two. He wanted to be as close as possible to her in death. So where are Thomas and Hannah buried, and can you visit them? Yes. So they are in a cemetery about 25-minute drive from Stratford, quite literally in a field. This brick enclosure here. And the field is known as Burnt House Field, and it's on the property where Thomas Lee's former home, Melancholic, was located before it burned in 1729. So let's take a look at Robert Carter III. So many of you may know him as the grandson of King Carter, and most notably for emancipating more than 500 slaves. This was the largest individual emancipation before 1860. So Carter III lived at Nominee Hall in Westmoreland County, which sadly no longer stands as it was burnt in 1850. But fortunately for us as historians, Philip Fithian was a tutor to the Carter family, and he documented his observations of daily life from 1773 to 1774. And it's this absolutely incredible resource, and it gives us so much insight into some notable figures in Virginia. And the Lees are included in this, and it's online and available to read, and it's a fun read at that. So Fithian recorded a conversation he had with Robert, and it goes like this. After supper, when all had retired but Mrs. Carter, Mr. Carter, and myself, the conversation being on serious matters, Mr. Carter observed that he much dislikes the common method of making burying yards around churches and having them almost open to every beast. He would have them at some small distance from the church, neatly and strongly enclosed, and the graves kept up decent and plain, but would have no splendid nor magnificent monument, nor even stone to say hic jacet, which by the way is Latin for here lies. He told us he proposes to make his own coffin and use it for a chest till its proper use shall be required, that no stone nor inscription to be put over him, and that he would choose to be laid under a shady tree where he might be undisturbed and sleep in peace and obscurity. He told us that with his own hands he planted and is with great diligence raising a catalpa tree at the head of his father who lies in the garden. Mrs. Carter begged that she might have a stone with this only for a monument. Here lies Anne Tasker Carter. So it's fascinating to see how nonchalant he was about his own memory being preserved, especially when you look at this portrait of him, like the extravagance that is in this portrait. And compared to his wife, Anne, as well, who apparently begged that at the very least she have a stone that says she was here. And unfortunately for Carter, he died in Baltimore and is buried there, I believe. So his final wishes never came to fruition. And we don't know if he made his own coffin, which I would love to know. And we don't know if he was buried in it, if he did make it. Okay, this one is a fun one. It's probably my favorite story from Westmoreland County, and I'm sure many of you will either shudder at this story or laugh along with me. I'm hoping you'll laugh along with me. You guys are here tonight, so you obviously enjoy some sort of morbid stories. So Hannah Bushrod Washington, She was the wife of John Augustine Washington, who is brother to George Washington. So she was essentially George Washington's sister-in-law, and she was petrified of being buried alive, so much so that she included this in her will. So again, excuse me, I'm going to do some reading. The cruel custom in this country of hurrying a poor creature into a coffin as soon as the managers of business, who are generally indeed people quite indifferent about the deceased or the most ignorant, suppose them dead. The friends at this awful moment quit the room and leave their dear friend to the discretion of these creatures, who tried of setting up in confinement have hurried into the coffin. So here she is letting us know that so often the deceased are left in the hands of people, who have no personal attachment or affiliation with them, and they're clearly there just to do their job. And she alludes to the fact that the dead are hurried into their coffin too soon, but it gets better. She goes on to say that no physician in the world could possibly tell if a person is dead until putrefaction takes place, and may have most assuredly been hurried away before they were dead. When it is thought that I am dead, that I remain in my bed quite undisturbed in every aspect, my face to be covered, not even the thinnest thing to be laid over it, I therefore most earnestly pray that I may be allowed to remain in my bed, just as I didst while living, until putrefaction by every known sign justifies my being in a coffin. I love this so much. She is so fearful of the thought of being buried alive that she insists she remains in her bed until her body begins to decay, and that will justify her being placed in a coffin, but only until then. And it's so grim. And she does not even want the thinnest thing to cover her face for fear she may still be alive, and just wants every aspect of her decay visible to those around her.
I love that, Amy. I had to unmute just for that. That was really, really detailed and fantastic.
This is Washington's sister-in-law, and it happened in Westmoreland County, and I think it's fascinating.
Amazing.
So Hannah passed not long after this will was created in 1801, and as most people in the 18th century, when they created a will, she knew while writing this that it wouldn't be long, and so she opens up her will with, "In the name of God, amen. I, Hannah Washington of Bushfield, in the parish of Copley and county of Westmoreland, being in sound mind, though weak in body and health, make this my last will and testament." So this is probably my favorite story of Westmoreland County, but the theme of being buried alive will continue. So, actor of fiction, the premature burial of Anne Hill Carter. So it would appear that from as early as the 14th century, there have been accounts of premature burials, or being buried alive, and it really reached its peak in the 18th and 19th centuries, and we start to see various safety coffins patented throughout this period. And I'm sure some of you have seen the addition of a bell system that was operated by the coffin's inhabitants should they be accidentally buried alive, and so on. But one story that has a tendency to rear its head is the story of Anne Hill Carter's premature burial. So Anne was the second wife to Revolutionary War hero Light Horse Harry, and the mother to Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And so the story goes that Anne, was somehow perceived as dead and was placed into the family vault. And there's various iterations of this, that we hear, but the most consistent is one that an enslaved man went down to check on the coffin, essentially, and heard yelling from within the coffin. Or there's even rumors that Light Horse Harry himself went to visit her in the vault and heard her yelling. This story, as crazy as it is, well, this isn't surprising, it made it onto the show Beyond Belief, Fact or Fiction, and it's on YouTube, and it's atrocious. It's hilariously awful, and I don't know who was on their research team or in their costume department for that matter. It's just awful. It was poorly researched, and they even said it in the wrong time period. But please just find it on YouTube and watch it and cringe with me over how terrible it is. But what's really alarming about the show is that at the end of the episode, they brand this story as fact, which is not remotely true at all. This story surfaced in the 1930s, and there's absolutely no record in the Lee family correspondence that mentions this incident whatsoever. And you would think it would be a pretty significant event to mention if it actually happened. So there are rumors that she may have suffered from narcolepsy and somehow fell into a sleep mistaken for death. But again, I think, it's safe to call this tale fiction. So the burial vaults at Stratford Hall, which unfortunately for me and my morbid self is empty. There's no one in it anymore. So the image on your left is what remained of the vault when it was excavated in 1937. And on the right, we have the reconstruction of the vault as it looks today. And, I've had conversations with Judy Henson, our soon to be retired director of research. She's been here for 50 years, might I add. And we believe that there were potentially 4 or 5 bodies buried in the vaults at one time. So the vault is essentially like a mausoleum. We know Mr. Casanova Lee, a descendant, paid for the excavation of the vaults, and he was given any bones that were excavated. And it's believed that his daughter was contacted many years later, but she was unaware of what happened to the remains. So we believe the remains included, Philip Ludwell Lee, his son of the same name, his daughter Matilda, who went on to marry Lighthorse Harry. They had a son who died. We believe he was buried at the governor's house in Virginia when Lighthorse was governor, and then dug up and brought back to Stratford, which, wasn't uncommon in the 18th century to do. And then finally, we think that a little Margaret Lee, who was 4 years old and the daughter of the last generations of the Lees to live here, would be placed in the vault as well. So there's this wonderful account of the burial vaults and what it looked like in 1858 in Bishop William Mead's Old Churches, Ministers, and Families of Virginia. So it goes, a floor covers the cemetery or vaults. In the center is a large trapdoor through which you descend by a ladder to the apartments below. I went down into it some years later, when nothing was to be seen but the bones of the deceased, which were scattered over the dirt floor. I was informed that it had sometimes been filled with water, so it essentially flooded, and that then the bones and skulls of the deceased might be seen floating upon the surface, at any rate, if stirred up with a pole, as sometimes done. So, wow, what an image. And, I can just imagine an enslaved man being tasked with showing me the vault and stirring up the bones, quite literally. And it's like something from a Mary Shelley or Bronte sister novel. And I think it's such a wonderful description. And we also know, thanks to Mead, that Elizabeth Stork, who later owned the property after the lease, requested the vault to be filled as the building on top was in such poor condition. We also have another bizarre account, which I unfortunately can't go into too much detail about because we just don't know. A skull was found in a hollowed out tree in the 1930s, and we have no idea who it was or where it was taken, but a mystery nonetheless. So consider this a plea from myself, and I know, Kelly, you feel the same way. If anyone knows of the whereabouts of these remains and where they were relocated to, please reach out to us. We just hope that they're all resting somewhere peacefully together. Okay, so I have talked long enough about the weirdly wonderful death tales relating to Westmoreland County, and there's so much in this county that I haven't even looked into, but can you imagine how many stories are out there all over Virginia, all over the country? So let's take a look at how death manifested, itself in material culture, which is, my particular forte. So Prior to the 18th century, from about the 16th century, death appeared in jewelry as what we know as memento mori. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this term. And it's a reminder to us that death is inevitable. And it's a Latin phrase that translates directly to remember you must die. And its imagery, is very iconic, and it features skulls and crossbones and coffins, and the symbolism would appear in rings, in pendants, in lockets, in brooches, you name it. And in the 16th century, we start to see this increase in mourning rings, just like this ring over here. And often money was set aside in wills to create these mourning rings for mourners of the deceased. So in the 17th century, we start to see the introduction of human hair, a physical remnant of the deceased, encased in this jewelry. And this spans the entirety of the 19th century. And I think for most people, we tend to associate hair work with that of the Victorian.
I didn't get that.
Oh,
could you try again?
My Siri is listening to me. That's not creepy at all. We have some ghostly activity going on here. Hold on, let me just, okay, go away, Siri. That was kind of creepy.
Very creepy.
And my Siri is a woman, so it was a man as all that came out, but okay. We're having a little seance over here. Anyways, I was saying that most people tend to associate hair work or the introduction of human hair with the 19th century, but it was happening long before that. Let's hope that doesn't happen again. So let's look at my favorite period of mourning and see how the outlook on death changed over the centuries. So throughout history, grieving a loved one has manifested itself into artistic and fashionable displays worn by those who are mourning. And the Neoclassical movement was a big part of the mid to late 18th century and even extended into the early 19th century. And with it, it kind of brought this new artistic outlook and moral outlook on death. So prior to 1760, death had been represented in this like ecclesiastical form, that judgment was from God only. And as mentioned previously, this idea that, death is inevitable and we are mere mortals, both key themes in, its portrayal. And the Neoclassical movement, for those of you that don't know, was inspired by the classical antiquities, archaeological discoveries of, like Pompeii and Herculaneum were influencing this movement. Essentially, everything was aspiring to be influenced by Grecian or Roman architecture, fashion, you name it, decorative arts. So Neoclassical memorial jewelry has heavy Greco-Roman influences because of this. And often it depicts, allegorical figures and, human hair was included, and it kind of gives us this representation of, the self in these pieces. So your classic Neoclassical piece usually features the weeping willow. So as you can see on your screen here, nearly all of these feature a weeping willow of sorts. And so this is a significant metaphor for human grief and sorrow. And it usually stands like slumped over the urn or the tomb in the depiction. And it was a common, symbol in mourning jewelry at the time, reflecting this kind of like somber mood of the piece, that nature here is personified and grieving with you. Secondly, we have the urn. We got an urn here, nearly in all of these pieces. There's an urn, again, which is a popularized representation of death during the Neoclassical movement, and another influence of the Greek and Roman art of the classical period. Female figures feature heavily, as you can see on your screen. Mourning was often a very female-centered practice, and it fell on women to, uphold this sort of idolized image of grief. So we start seeing depictions of women in these tiny art pieces, and they usually represent the mourner. Cypress trees, if you look just here, there's a cypress tree. The presence of this tree is, again, a direct influence of the Roman practice of carrying cypress branches as a sign of respect for the dead. And then in the Western world and in the 18th century, it became symbolic of hope because it points upwards to heaven. As I mentioned, again, the introduction of human hair, as you can see in this piece, in most pieces, hair is hidden behind, like in this pendant, for instance, or this brooch. There's most likely human hair. And I should preface as well, none of these items are in our collection, but I'm going to show you some that are, but they just show the common themes throughout. And lastly, allegorical figures like hope down here were commonly incorporated. So hope is one of the 7 virtues, and she's depicted here with her anchor, and she usually represents or conveys, the mourner's hope that the deceased is at peace and with their God in heaven. So again, we have this very Christian influence being showcased, but merged with these classical symbols. So let's take a look at our wonderful collection. This is perhaps one of my favorite objects in the collection, so I'm glad I'm talking about it. So this piece dates between 1817 and 1818, and it's painted on ivory and it sits under glass. So the pendant here memorializes the death of Emily Lee and was commissioned by her parents. And as I mentioned before, most mourning jewelry from the period featured human hair, which we can see here in this other image. So this is the reverse of the piece, and we can see there is a little lock of blonde hair, and it's fastened with 4 pearls here, and the pearls indicate loss of a child, and they also indicate the age of a child. So she was 4 years old. And what's really moving about this piece, really lovely about this piece, is that surrounding her hair is a lock, a protective plait of the mother's hair, what we believe to be the mother's hair. The grief-stricken mother is also represented over here. She is depicted, with her hands in prayer, and she gazes up towards the sky, and there's 2 angels that are, offering this sort of consoling verse, which says, "Weep not, she is with her God and me." She's dressed extremely classically. We can see the fabric on her body drapes similar to those of Greek and Roman statues. And her hair is also in a really Greco-Roman style. And she wears a veil, which is probably symbolic of her mourning. And just here, we can see a black sash, which again indicates to me that she is the mourner, she is the mother. So moving on to another wonderful piece. This piece is a pendant, and it's in our collection, and it memorializes the life of a 17-year-old Rebecca T. Lee, and she died in March 5th of 1792. So it depicts a woman holding an urn, and she's got another black sash here, which again indicates to me that this is a mourner. And she's again in a very neoclassical landscape. It's like spot the weeping willow, spot the urn, spot the tomb. Again, it's all very evocative of this period. And around the piece, just here, it says, "Lord gave and hath taken away." And on the back of the piece here, we've got some wonderful hair work with the initials AFB, which I've tried to figure this out, and I think it stands for Anne Fenton Brent, and she was the daughter of Thomas Ludwell Lee. So she was essentially the granddaughter of the Thomas and Hannah who founded Stratford. I'll try and make it easy for you guys. I hate spoken genealogy, so I'm trying my best not to do it. My third favorite mourning piece we have in the collection because of the hair work involved in here. Is this one here, but unfortunately we don't know who it's memorializing. However, the dearly departed is likely female, as you can see here. She's being lifted up by two angels. And we have this haloed bearded figure, which is presumably Jesus Christ, and he sits beside an urn. Again, shocker, there's a weeping willow, and inscribed on the urn pedestal or pediment is, "Of such are the kingdom of heaven." And this quote may even indicate that this individual up here is a child or a young girl. The full quote goes, "But Jesus said, suffer little children and forbid them not to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." And on the reverse of the piece, we've got this beautiful, beautiful hair work in a checkerboard formation. So it's most likely this deceased hair and the mourner, the wearer of the pendant's hair, together. And to create this very like straight, flat hair, they would use like a glue called gum arabic, and it was usually applied and the hair was stiffened. And then in the 19th century, you see this practice done, and women would cut out flowers and all sorts of different shapes out of the hair. So it's essentially like hair paper. I just want to showcase these two wonderful portraits and wonderful examples, Virginian examples, might I add, of mourning jewelry worn and depicted in portraiture. So we have the wonderful portrait of Sarah Fitzhugh Edmonds on the left, which was painted around the time of her marriage to her husband. A portrait of him also exists, so it's like a duo portrait, and it was painted at the same time by the same artist. And after doing some detective work, I can only imagine that this was like the first portrait of a newly married Sarah. So she opted to incorporate a mourning miniature into her portrait, and I was trying to figure out who this could be. So she was married in 1808, and just 4 years prior, her mother passed. And so maybe not, but maybe this miniature memorializes her mother, and perhaps Sarah wanted her mother to be with her in some form as a new bride. So again, weeping willow, urn, female figure. You're going to be sick of me saying this, but it's true. It's so common. And on the right here, we have a portrait of Alice Littlepage Taylor Ingram with her daughter, Mary Ingram. And we see in the child's hand another mourning miniature. We can just make out there's an urn here, and there's definitely a weeping willow here, which immediately tells me and the viewer that it's a mourning piece and it's memorializing someone. My detective work has yet to get to the bottom of who this individual they're mourning is, and who it's dedicated to. Perhaps it's a child of Alice, potentially a sibling of young Mary. There is more to be discovered on that, but both of these portraits can be found in the collection at Colonial Williamsburg, and I think it's a really wonderful example of Virginian portraiture and the inclusion of mourning jewelry in art. So keeping with the theme of neoclassicism, what happens when a nation mourns? So when George Washington died in 1799, we start to see how the country mourned for him. And we see this appear in several like artistic mediums, whether it's, a small miniature or presented in print or needlework. And in our collection, we have this incredible neoclassical needlework depicting two women and a child. You can't see in this image, but you'll see in the next slide, placing a floral swag on top of the urn, under, shocker, another weeping willow. And inscribed over here, we've got in memory of the illustrious Washington, and it's even sequined. You can see the spangles. So American artist Samuel Fowle was known for designing these large neoclassical mourning scenes, and young girls would then practice their embroidery skills using these pieces. So his wife Elizabeth ran a popular embroidery school in Philadelphia, And Fowell himself would sketch these scenes on silk for his students to then embroider, and then he would complete like some of the painted details afterwards. But again, we can see here the mourner with her black lined veil and her black sash. Wonderful imagery. So it's following all the rules of neoclassicism. This is a piece in full, and I apologize for the horrible photo. I had to take a picture of it today, and it has a glass cover to it, and so I didn't want my reflection in the image. But notice again, we've got cypress trees over here. We've got weeping willow, like I mentioned, the urn, everything that indicates that this is a mourning piece, regardless of the sad nature of the piece. So we start seeing this practice of memorializing Washington and his legacy quite literally woven into the education of young girls. And so his memory is preserved for decades, centuries to come in skilled embroidered work by young girls. So just for a fun comparison, the Met has this version of the embroidery piece in their collection. It's again a Fowell School piece, and we could see the same layout, the same symbolism, the same characters, just slightly different, due to the artistic style of the young girl who was creating it, the young artist that she was. And it's so beautiful. And I think it's really great that we have a piece that the Met also has, but it's slightly different. So I have come to the end of my talk, and I thank you all for listening. But I'd just like to remind everyone that if you haven't already seen our exhibit, Stratford at the Crossroad, Atlantic Cultures and the Creation of America, I encourage you to please come out, and you can see the objects I've discussed in person, and even some 19th century examples that I haven't talked about, because there's so much content here, I couldn't possibly talk about the 19th century tonight. So this is it. Thank you all for joining me. And I want to leave you all with this thought. I just ask that you think about, the ways in which you think about death and memory, or the ways that you memorialize loved ones. Think about what your legacy will be, and how will it be materialized for future generations to ponder, like I did today in my office all day. And especially today in a world, where death is, outsourced to the death care industry, and, is almost completely removed from the home and the domestic space. Perhaps, these objects that were created in the 18th and 19th century kind of serve as this like gentle reminder of our societal detachment, I guess, to death, and, allow us to think of cool and fun ways to explore how we materialize family memory. So thank you for listening, and I'm gonna stop sharing and back into the Zoom.
Thank you, Amy. That was
There
awesome. Awesome. I'll clap for everybody. So they can't clap for you.
Parched.
I'm sure. No, that was awesome. That was really awesome. I was watching you give the talk, and I've seen those pieces a million times, but it started getting me thinking about, like you just said at the end, sort of like, would I want something like that, sort of when I die, and like
Exactly.
those things last forever in some ways. And those little, the miniatures are gorgeous. I mean, I like a good hair ring.
Right. I can see my hair
thinking about the endless choices of things.
Exactly.
I love it. All right, well, we do have a question, so we'll go ahead and get to it. It's from Deborah. This is an interesting one. Deborah asks or says, I have read that the brown sepia toned paint used in the decoration of the memento mori incorporated hair from the deceased. Is this true?
Hey, wonderful question. I haven't heard about burnt hair, but I've definitely heard about hair being physically incorporated into the ink or the paint. So great question, but I don't know. And now I need to Google that. That is so interesting.
It would make sense in a way. It's just more of that person's.
It's a darker color and more of the human essence, so to speak.
Absolutely. Any other questions from our wonderful, attentive audience?
Hopefully I didn't.
So fascinating. I haven't. So the one piece with the sort of like checkerboard looking hair, Have I not seen that? I was like, where is that thing? It's
In the
amazing.
exhibit, but it's flat. I'm thinking we need to
Okay.
raise it up, raise those pieces up just so that you
A
can
little
see
mirror
the
under or something so
little
you can
mirror
see it.
action.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah. That's some of my favorite stuff in our collection, and as is yours, you know?
Same.
Yeah, really fascinating. Any other questions? That was
Making my
great.
life easy.
Your slides are also always stunning, which, you know, I think
Yeah.
help keep people engaged.
Yes. Here's
Yeah, and I do want to know where the Lee's bones went. You know,
yeah.
it's
So
wild that
I
someone
almost
grabbed them almost 100 years ago, and we have no idea where they went.
I almost wanted to include like a wanted poster. Lee bones, where are they?
Seriously. We have a question from Monica. How is it decided where a person was buried? By the church, by the home?
A lot of times it was indicated in a will, or the family just chose where it was. There was no real like strict regime involved. So
What I love, sorry.
I was just going to say it was just family or the deceased instructed in their will. That is all. Yeah.
What I love about Virginia, it's one of the states that allow you to bury humans on your private land. So you can literally own a half an acre somewhere, or, you know, a plot, and have a family burial on it. When you drive off the bigger roads, you see all these tiny family burial plots with like 5 graves and 6 graves. It's kind of, I think it's important, you know, it's a distinct bit of Virginia's norms and cultures.
Yeah, exactly.
Questions here. Tiffany asks, any burial customs uncovered from the enslaved at Stratford? Yes, absolutely. Yes. And another question from Monica, were the enslaved folks buried? I can go ahead and...
I will redirect you the expert.
I know, I feel like I should probably give a talk on that next.
I really think so.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So we know of at least 2 burial grounds where the enslaved people were buried at Stratford. One is marked. It's very central to the site. The other one is a little bit off of what you consider the site now. It's on land that we currently own that has been part of Stratford's estate for hundreds of years. We are actually right now working very closely with the descendant community on memorializing that space. We use the marked cemetery every year for First Africans Day. We have ceremonies there, and we honor the ancestors in that space. The descendants are front and center in what's happening with that, and in the research to figure out who's buried there and all those things that you just asked about. So yes, I'll do a separate talk on that, but absolutely. And that's my lane, and I absolutely love when people ask questions about that. Yeah. But we'll also be hosting a seminar or a symposium of some sort in the spring on African American cemeteries and burial practices. So stay tuned for the date on that. We're trying to figure out when to do it. So please keep Stratford in your eye.
Any other?
Ontavia says, talk about the enslaved burials. Yes, I will absolutely do that. It's going to happen. The program will happen. A matter of fact, I'll probably just go ahead and schedule it maybe for the spring after the symposium. So thank you all for asking those questions. Anything else?
Any other last minute curiosities? And
please, if you would like to come visit Stratford and you would like, you know, a sort of a curator tour or anything like that, just email us. We can make that happen. We love when people travel. I know Stratford's not on the way to most places. You know, it's not right off of 95. It's not off of 5. It's not off of a lot of the main highways, but we have exceptional history there. And we're really proud of the work that we're doing. And we love to show off our site and our history, right?
Absolutely. And awesome. Please email me if you have any other questions that you haven't thought of regarding death and mourning. I'd be happy to answer.
We have one last question from Donna. This is actually a great one. So how long was the mourning period in the 18th century? And maybe just answer for the 19th too, because that's interesting.
Right. So in the 19th century and for the 18th century, I believe as well, mourning dominated how a woman dressed for like a year and a half, I believe. So, and I think that was a similar time frame in the 18th century, but I can't remember off the top of my head. And you would have different phases of mourning. So you would go from deep mourning to half mourning. So that stage went from, you know, all black to half black, to light mourning, which, you know, incorporated mourning jewelry, and you could wear like purples and different hues and so on. So yes.
So fascinating. Awesome. Well, thank you, Amy. That was a pleasure, as always. Thank you all for zooming in. Please stay tuned for our upcoming programs. We definitely have a talk coming up in December on Arthur Lee, as well as a program on chocolate. So please do not be shy. Zoom on in soon and have a wonderful day. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. Good evening. Bye.